Welcome to the Providence College Podcast. My name is Joe Carr. We are pleased to present Beyond Blackboards and White Coats, an uncommon career in science. This was a Friday, September 28th talk by Kelly Page, a member of PC's class of 1993. A biology and chemistry major as an undergraduate, she is vice president and head of the German oncology business at Takeda Oncology. The talk presented to a group of faculty members, staff members, students, and alumni illuminated the notion that a science education within the context of a liberal arts curriculum can open many and often unexpected doors. The college's annual Anna E. LaVoie Lecture, Ms. Page's talk, was part of the opening celebration of the Providence College Science Complex.
So let me tell you first just a couple things about myself. So I'm actually a native Rhode Islander. I grew up just outside of Westerly, the oldest of three kids. My parents are here, my sister. I wasn't planning on attending Providence, so I will be honest right from the start. There is a little bit of a contradiction wanting to be a science major in liberal arts. And I had it in my mind, knowing that I was going to be a chemistry major at the time, that I wanted to go to a big science school. And it wasn't until my mom said, we should really go to Providence and take a drive through, and I loved it. I loved everything about it, and immediately decided that Providence was where I wanted to go to school. So my decision was to be a chemistry major. I ultimately ended up double majoring in chemistry and biology, thinking that I would go to graduate school or go to medical school, actually. But as you go through school, you realize that your aspirations and what you think you want to do changes, and you don't really know. And so for me, I was a second semester senior, had decided that medical school wasn't for me, had enrolled in a PhD program in chemistry and decided that wasn't for me, and had no idea what I was going to do. And I'm sure other people find themselves in the same situation. And what ultimately happened, just out of kind of sheer luck, was a family friend said, I work at Pfizer, you need a job, and you have student loans to pay. Why don't you work there until you figure out what you want to do? And so I ultimately took a job at Pfizer. I started a couple weeks after graduation in the Department of Analytical Chemistry in the Pharmaceutical Sciences Department in Groton, Connecticut. And I have to say, in all honesty, I had no idea what the job was going to be. I knew what analytical chemistry was. I knew kind of what Pfizer was, but I had no idea what I was actually going to be doing for a job. But I really thought it was going to be a year. Maybe I would go to graduate school. Maybe I'd study for the MCATs. And then I would figure out what my career was really going to be. I'm going to talk a little bit about pharmaceutical companies. And there's a couple of things I want everyone to kind of make sure they understand. The first is, so pharmaceutical companies sort of have three groups, right? There's research and development, and they're really discovery science. Development, which is when a molecule enters into the clinic, really, until it gets approved. And then the commercial organization. And the commercial organization is really the sales and getting the drug to patients once it's approved. And in a commercial organization, there's a global strategy level, there's regions, and there's countries. And I'm going to talk about all of these, so I want to make sure everybody sort of understands the different parts of the organization. And sort of, when you develop a new drug, you start in R&D. It's very R&D intensive. And as you go through the kind of development of a drug and get a drug approved, it really becomes a very commercial, heavy project. And I'll talk a little bit about this because it influences my career as we got through. So, I figured out what my job was when I got there. And I was actually trained well to do it. Basically, so this is just sort of a picture of what my job was. We developed assays, analytical assays of all different types, to test new drug molecules. We looked at purity, we looked at potency, we looked at manufacturing and the batch records for manufacturing to make sure that what we were producing was actually what we were supposed to be producing. I was assigned to a lab that was working on late-stage products. And so everything that we did basically went into filings for the FDA and for the European Medicines Agency. And ultimately, and the product I worked on first was Zithromax, which many of you have probably taken in 5-day capsules. I worked on the IV. And basically what analytical chemistry did, one more click, is provides all the information that you actually see on the label in terms of how to use the drug. How stable is the drug? When does the drug expire? How strong is it? What the ingredients are? How long can it sit at room temperature? How do you dilute it and still have the drug that you need to actually give to a patient? So all of the information that you ultimately see on the label about the drug formulation itself comes through analytical chemistry. One of the things that I realized coming out of Providence at the time, and I think this is very different now, is I was really prepared and studied for a career that would go into graduate school, that would go into medical school. And I think that's part of the topic and the title of my presentation is there's more to do with science beyond just blackboards and teaching or lab coats. And what I found was that while I knew what chemistry was, what I knew what biology was, I didn't realize how many subspecialties there were. And this started to kind of anchor my thinking into all of the different types of, even just chemistry or even just biology, how many different types of careers that you could have. Because by this point, while I was doing analytical chemistry, we were working with physical chemists, we were working with organic chemists, we were with chemical and process engineers, we're figuring out how to make big manufacturing lots of these drugs, formulators, pharmacists, people who specialized in regulatory affairs and how you take all this information and actually get it into something that a reviewer can use to approve your drug. And had I not sort of dug into pharmaceutical sciences, I would have never really realized that there were so many different potential career paths available. And at this point, what I was thinking about doing actually was going back to school for chemistry still. And then some things sort of start to change. In '99, it's kind of at that point of knowing I was kind of ready to get out of the lab. Lab work was great, and the nice thing about lab work that I realized is that at the end of the day, you have a product, right? You have data, you have something measurable about what you've done. And the moment you leave the lab, I couldn't figure out how I actually spent my days. You have something very tangible with science. But at the same time, I realized that there was more to the pharmaceutical industry that I wanted to explore. And what I decided to do was basically start to look at leaving the lab and also to go back to school. And this is when I went back and got an MBA and moved on to a different role in the pharmaceutical industry. Another thing happened in '99. And it's funny how life impacts your decisions. In July of '99, a very close personal friend's mother was diagnosed with lymphoma. In August, my dad's brother was diagnosed with lymphoma. And in September, my dad was diagnosed with lymphoma. Within a year, my uncle and Francis had both passed away. And my dad is now a 19-year survivor of lymphoma. And at that time, I decided that I knew what I wanted to do. My passion became finding new cures for cancer. There was no doubt what I was going to spend my career doing. But also, besides that, what I realized is that when you're a cancer patient, you're a caregiver, you have no idea how to handle that. You have no idea what resources you have to support you, how to be a caregiver. And a lot of what I do now really is thinking about what do patients need, what do caregivers need to be able to actually support a cancer patient and know the resources that are available to them when they are diagnosed. And there's so many that people don't know that they have. And this is a real question I asked. At the point that I was leaving the lab, I honestly, again, didn't know what I was going to do. And I think this is, a theme for students, is that you don't always know what you're going to do. You have been successful doing one thing, and what you have to realize is science is a foundation, but you have so many skills beyond that that you learn over time, and you start to utilize those other skills as much as you do your formal training. The person that I worked for in analytical chemistry actually moved to a group called Drug Development Management. And he called me one day and he said, "You want to be a project manager?" And I honestly said to him, I have no idea what a project manager does. Like, you're asking me to do a job, but I have no idea what you even mean. And he convinced me to come over and spend a day with him and his group. And I decided that this was something that I wanted to do. Because what drug development management and project management in oncology taught me is really how you develop a drug. So I knew this little world of pharmaceutical sciences, but what I learned in project management was you have these big cross-functional teams who are really accountable for getting a drug from when it first goes into a patient until it gets approved, and then onwards after you sell it. So my role in drug development management was around the management of these cross-functional teams, all of the operational planning, all of the risk management, all of the budget management, timelines, risks, anything that you could think of that would affect our way of getting this drug from point A to point B. And it was an amazing opportunity because what I learned is, while I thought the pharmaceutical world was sort of, me and this team leader in pharmaceutical sciences, you realize there's so many, again, other opportunities that you never knew really existed when you were thinking about your career in science. So I realized that to get like a drug developed, you go from your clinicians and doctors and scientists. You've got toxicologists, and I always thought toxicology was one thing, but it's not. Toxicology is genetic toxicologists, reproductive toxicologists, pathologists, veterinarians, everybody who's looking at the drug safety and what this potential, drug will do in the body in terms of safety. Legal. So we have all sorts of lawyers, between contract lawyers, business lawyers, intellectual property lawyers, that were all involved in our ability to develop a drug. Commercial, marketing, new product planning, all the people who were giving guidance on what the market would potentially look like for this product, what a patient needed, what the journey was like for a patient, how do we meet that need. Clinical operations, and again, on some of these, I also tried to put the degree so that you kind of understand like what types of backgrounds these people had. Clinical operations run clinical studies. Data managers, there's statisticians, there's clinical research monitors, all sorts of roles for scientists to really just run clinical studies. Drug metabolism, so I didn't realize at the time that there were specialists who look at how a body absorbs the drug, how it distributes it, how it metabolizes it, or how it excretes it. All of these things have very specialized trainings that would allow people to really understand how the drug was working. And then still you had the research scientists and the regulatory affairs people and all the others still involved. So I think kind of what I learned in this role was, how do you develop a drug? And it was really interesting to see how many different disciplines, how many different types of scientific backgrounds had to come together, had to collaborate to be able to bring one medicine to patients. So I started my career in drug development. We were actually one of the first groups that were working in immunotherapy. And now we have a couple of immunotherapies that are now approved. But back in 2001, 2002, this was like the cutting edge of scientific research for cancer. Because before this time, you had chemotherapy, and most of you probably know chemotherapy. It's quite potent, but the problem is you get a lot of toxicity with it because it's untargeted. And then we had entered into the realm of targeted therapies that were very specific to a specific mutation on a cancer cell. The immune approach was basically, how do you harness the immune system to be able to battle cancer? With every person's cancer being slightly genetically different, it was still trying to be understood, why can't the immune system adapt and be able to fight the cancer itself? And so the CTLA-4 program was one of the first programs I worked on. And what I sort of started the phase 3 programs, the commercial team was formed, and by this point I had my MBA, and was asked to kind of join the commercial team that was starting up to get ready to actually get the approval and market this drug. And so I ended up doing this move and moving to global commercial, where a lot of what we did was on understanding the needs of customers. What does the doctor need to help support his patient? What does the patient need? Forecasting, market research. Oh, thank you. So great. pricing and reimbursement, Congress strategies, how do we show up to the public, communication strategies. And again, I started to realize that in the pharmaceutical industry, we have specialists who do all of this work. And again, it opened to my eyes up to the number of possibilities that as a science major and understanding the basic science, you could also start to expand into. At the time, I also worked on Camtazar, which is an approved drug for metastatic colorectal cancer. And it was incredibly interesting because Camtazar had been on the market for a very long time. But the discussions we were having was Camtazar able to shrink liver metastases in a way that they could then be surgically resected? And how do we use our drugs to enable other treatments that could potentially extend a patient's life? And so it was about taking an older product and finding new ways to really help patients, which I thought was just an incredible opportunity. So again, each time I moved in my career, it was a bit serendipitous, but it opened my eyes up to a number of other possibilities. And again, my world had been pharmaceutical sciences, it had been R&D, and then you find out that there's this whole other world that if you had a science background and a business background that you could then start to actually explore in terms of pricing, market access, drug reimbursement. Every country around the world has a different way of reimbursing drugs and a different policy on paying for drugs. Understanding that, and it's one of the most biggest questions of our time, is the pricing of drugs and the access to medicine. The specialists who do that, health economists, finance people, we have drug ethicists who help us understand what the right policy is around some of these things. Obviously sales and medical affairs. And then you have, as I said earlier, commercial is broken down into big strategic, global commercial, but it also is regional, local, and a number of other levels. Every country where we sell drug, you have to have a local office there that's responsible and legally and regulatory responsible for access to that product. So I worked there until 2008, and I kind of hit another crossroad. And again, my next learning is sort of every 5 years, I kind of start to look for that next role that I might be interested in doing and get a little bit bored. In 2008, I made the decision to actually leave Pfizer and move to Takeda. At the time, it was a biotech. It was Millennium that had just been acquired by Takeda. And it was a hard decision because I actually, again, going back to that first slide, actually left the commercial organization where I really enjoyed it to move back to the R&D organization. And I joined as the head of project management, which really I was brought in to really rebuild the group. Project management at Takeda at the time had 3 or 4 people. They were expanding their pipeline, and I was brought in to really build new processes, new capabilities, and strengthen that overall structure for how our teams would operate. And it was a great opportunity, but it taught me something really interesting about people management and individual contribution. At some point in your career, there will be a point, maybe I'll say something different. You start off being an individual contributor, and like I said about lab data, it's very easy to see what you do every day. Once you become a people manager, you have to build a whole new set of skills because your success is actually determined by everybody else. So it becomes more about collaboration, empowerment, trusting people, coaching them. And they were skills that, again, I think my learning now is the need to continually to learn those skills throughout your career. You're actually never done learning. And whether you go back for formal degrees, whether you go back for executive education, the point really is the skills that you need continue to evolve over time. And it's really important to develop those skills. You don't think you need them, but you're actually using some of them, and I'll talk about that in a minute at the end. The other issue that I had with people management was I really missed teams. I realized that the energy for me wasn't about what I was actually doing each day. It was the cross-functional nature of the team and all of us working together to bring forward a product to patients. And that was what was really energizing me. And I was lucky because this was 2008. In 2009, we in-licensed a product that was at the time SGN-35. It's probably the most important point in my career because it's actually a drug that is now approved for lymphoma, and you heard my history with lymphoma a few minutes ago. But it was also amazingly cutting edge. So SGN-35 is an antibody drug conjugate. So imagine an antibody, for anyone who can kind of see the little Y figure, that has, through a linker system, toxin, chemotherapy bound to it. And the whole premise of an ADC is that you can deliver chemotherapy in a very targeted way so that you can have the potency, as you do with a chemotherapy, but you don't have all the toxicity because you're not getting all that off-target binding. There had been one approved ADC before Adcetris. It was called Mylotarg, and actually was pulled off the market because the linker system would fall apart in plasma and wouldn't actually deliver the drug to the actual target. So Seattle Genetics came up with a new linker system that could actually hold these molecules stable. When it is now approved for Hodgkin lymphoma and for anaplastic large cell lymphoma. Anaplastic large cell lymphoma in the relapse setting prior to Adcetris had a 3-month survival if you were an ALK-negative ALCL patient. Our 5-year data is we have 61% of patients alive at 5 years. It is actually incredible, the effect that this drug has had on patients, and it's really important. This is a picture of our team at the European Medicines Agency when we got the second Hodgkin lymphoma indication approved. And it has just been the first time in my career to really take a product from clinical development to patients and have that approval happen. Once we were approved, I actually moved back to the commercial organization and decided that commercial was where actually the rest of my career would be. And it wasn't because of the desire to actually not be in an R&D environment. It's because what I found for me is that commercial is actually where you make treatment available to patients. It's where you deal with issues of drug access. It's where you deal with issues of making sure doctors understand the needs of patients and that you're providing a drug that meets the need of patients. And I really liked that external-facing role versus the internal company role that was more the science-based roles. So when I moved to commercial, I was actually responsible for the launch of all of our next indications and worked as an alliance manager and was the head of lymphoma strategy. So all of the other lymphoma brands that we were working on actually all also reported into me. So my job was really around how are we going to meet the needs with new drugs for lymphoma patients. I loved the job, and I didn't want to give up Adcetris, but at some point in your career, you also realize that breadth of experience becomes important. And if I wanted to stay in a commercial organization, my only role couldn't be the brand leader for Adcetris. It had to be a bit more. And so I was promoted to Vice President of Oncology Strategy and Planning in 2016. And besides the Adcetris role, what I really did was sort of worked with the president of business unit to define what our global oncology strategy was. By 2025, what kind of company did we want to be? What kind of products do we want to have? What therapeutic areas did we want to be working in? How big did we need to be? What capabilities would we need to have? And really defining our vision for where we would go over the next 10 years. I was also responsible for all of our sort of internal governance, for forecasting and analytics, and also for competitive intelligence. The other opportunity I had was that we acquired a company for a small biotech, it's not that small, a biotech company in Boston in the end of 2016. And I led the commercial integration activities for that. And this was really interesting because beyond just sort of the normal, we're buying a company and we have to do certain things, it really opened my eyes to how many things we had to do to really make sure it worked. So besides just making sure people had badges or had working computers, we had to make sure that we had licenses to sell the drug in every state. We had to make sure their contracts were then put into our name so that we could legally work with them. They also had 2 products. One was near approval, brigatinib, which is now Lumbrig, and Iclusig. And actually, the most important part of the job was making sure that every patient, no matter what we were doing from a business perspective, that every patient had access to the drug the next time that they went and needed it. Because if we interrupted that, it would have been a failed, acquisition. So I spent a year sort of doing this. And then again, another thing happens. Besides breadth of experience, if you're in a commercial organization, it becomes you need to have P&L experience. So what's P&L experience? P&L experience is basically you have to manage the business, whether it is your operating costs, your revenue, everything that goes into the decision-making, the legalities. Ultimately, you own that accountability. And so this is like the ultimate place for commercial experience that you need to have. Like, the other reason to do it, and this is really important to me, is that the country role and moving into a place where you can have P&L experience is actually the closest you can get to a patient. It is where the drug has to leave the pharmacy and get it to that hospital. It is where the doctor is actually making that treatment decision. It is where that caregiver is giving care. And so at the country level, it was the place you could get the most firsthand experience of how the patients would use the drug and how the drug would do. And so in January, I moved to Berlin, and I'm now the head of basically a $60 million business, with 65 people, soon to be 4 marketed products, and responsible for all of the marketing, medical, sales, patient advocacy, analytics that happen in the country. It's an amazing job. I didn't realize my challenge, though, would be I sort of went from this to this, and where I was dealing with a $5 billion acquisition one day, I was now dealing with a single customer complaint the next day. And it's been a really interesting evolution to move from focusing on global strategy to really focusing day-to-day of the operations within a country. So we'll see what happens next. I don't know what happens next. I'm in a 2-year contract, so we'll see what happens next January. But I want to talk for a minute briefly about why I picked pharmaceuticals. And really, it becomes the impact that you can have. There are hundreds of different cancers. Nearly every one of the cancers is uncurable. Patients need new treatments. If I just look at Adcetris, and again, the 2 indications we have for Adcetris are very small indications. We've treated 45,000 patients around the world, and it's approved in 71 countries. No other job that I can think of really can give me that type of reach for what I do every day. And and not only that, it's what the patients who can go on and do. So I have 2 examples here. One is Ethan Zahn. I don't know if anyone watches Survivor. Ethan won Survivor Africa. After he won Survivor Africa, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma and ended up having multiple rounds of therapy, ended up getting Adcetris, and had a stem cell transplant, and is now surviving 10 years later, which was unheard of at the time before Adcetris if you had failed your early therapies. But Ethan went on and started an organization called Grassroots Soccer, where he was a professional soccer player in Zimbabwe. But Ethan went on to use soccer as a platform to teach children about HIV awareness, about how to prevent transmission of HIV. So he's given back in so many ways. And I always think about the fact that he wouldn't be able to do that if we weren't able to provide Adcetris at the time that we did for him. Similarly is Carol Jarvis. So Carol is actually a jazz trombonist. So if you think about, careers you can have, you can be a jazz trombonist. But Carol's toured with Bon Jovi, she's toured with Sting, she's toured with Seal, and they used to fly her to her treatments for Adcetris. It's really a really interesting story. But now the proceeds for her albums, she actually gives back to the cancer hospital where she had her stem cell transplant and did her major part of her treatments, the Christie Hospital in Manchester, England. And so it's not only, I think, the impact that I feel like I can have, it's giving so many other people the chance to have impact in their lives. And whether it's their careers, whether it's with their children, the average Hodgkin lymphoma patient is 35 years old, right? They're in the middle of starting their careers, starting families, and to give them a chance at longer life is something that, I can't say strongly enough about the impact that it makes me feel like I have every day. I have two take-home messages, and then I think we're just about out of time. The first is, I really think a career is about finding your passion. My science background is still foundational to everything I do. I have to have that credibility to be able to have some of the conversations I can have, to be able to head a medical affairs department without being an MD. I have to be able to talk the language. But I also think it's about the fact that you can combine it with other passions and still do amazing things. And I was thinking about the fact that if you love writing and you're a science major, there are so many jobs for medical writers, like writing clinical study reports, writing publications. If you like art, our agencies do almost all of our promotional things, and combining a knowledge of science with your love of art would be an incredible opportunity to use both, because careers are long. You really have to love what you do. And I'm looking at some of my friends, we know careers are long. But if you like if you're into finance and you like science, there's pharmacoeconomics, there's all sorts of health policy type things that require finance. There's drug pricing and reimbursement. And so I think it's really important to find those passions and use those. It doesn't have to be a strictly bench science career. It's about combining the things you love, and you'll do really well at it if you really take the time to think about that. I was asked to say a couple of things about my PC education. And at first I was really offended when the person said this to me about my thinking differently. And then I realized what a compliment it was. Most of the scientists I work with really had very science-driven educations. All of the classes that they took were science. And I think having a liberal arts education really helped me think. And I didn't appreciate that so much at the start of my career because it was so science-based. But as I've moved through my career, what I do now is more about having good judgment, making good decisions, collaborating, communicating, being ethical and moral. And those are things that so much of that I took away from PC, about how I think. I use the Weston Civ example. Civ combines all these disciplines into kind of one sort of impact on history or impact on an event. That's what we do every day. We combine all these different disciplines, whether it is a toxicologist report or a clinical report or what commercial wants, and try to combine it into one thing and one decision that we can all move forward with. So while you are learning Civ, you're actually learning all of these other skills that you will use later in your career. And I think this is really important for me because everyone sees the news on pharmaceutical companies, right? We have complicated decisions that we have to make. We make decisions that impact whether a patient can have access to drug or not, how much people are going to pay for their drugs. Do we give free access? How do you treat clinical trial patients, right? There's all sorts of things about the ethical treatment of patients, and are they consented to do the studies that you want to do on them as subjects? Interactions with healthcare providers, ensuring that we behave appropriately and build trust so that we're not unduly influencing inappropriately to a healthcare provider. And all of those things are what PC taught me, beyond just being a chemistry and biology major. So my final thought, I think, is what I just said. Realize that beyond your education at PC as a scientist, you're learning so many more invaluable skills. Take chances. I never thought I was trained for my next career move, and somebody let me do it. And here I am today talking to all of you. And someone once said to me, I didn't get a job that I really wanted to have. And the person said to me, career disappointments are like dropped ice cream cones. I was like, I don't understand this. And he said, you're really disappointed at the moment it happens, but there's another ice cream shop around the corner. And you kind of have to remember that. It's worth trying. You may not get the job each time, but the next one will come around the corner. And you have to keep that sort of attitude that to take the chances and take the risk to go for what you want. Find your passion. As I said, the moment that we had cancer impact our family, I found my passion, and it's what drives me every day to do what I do. And last but not least, I think your PC education will help you in more ways than you will ever realize. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for joining us today. You can subscribe to the Providence College podcast at all the usual places, and they're available on the college's YouTube channel. Feedback is welcome at podcast@providence.edu. Thanks to our producer, Chris Judge. I'm Joe Carr. Until next time.